Next, I would like to recognize Assistant City Manager Rick Buss to introduce the Economic Impact Update.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. To my right is Jim Rounds with Round Consulting. He's the President and CEO. And tonight represents just another step in us on a journey of evaluating an economic development opportunity and also proactively sharing with you and the public an update of where we are. So one of the things I wanted to emphasize tonight is, make sure I got this going the right way, is we are still very early in an evaluation process. And we have proactively, been very, very transparent with where we are in the process. We've posted a ton of stuff on our website. We've done webinars. We've got a video that's coming out tomorrow in response to a lot of questions the public has. What is an unintended consequence of that is that I believe we've created an impression that there's a decision imminent. That is not the case, Mayor and Council. There's not a decision imminent. We are early in the process. So that's why we put, what we've completed so far is a feasibility study, which we've posted online, including the 2,000 studies. Jim will talk a little bit about the Airpark Economic Impact Study that's been done. We had a memo that's posted on that. The final report is completed. We intended to post it earlier, but it will be posted tomorrow. And right now, we're in the middle of a site selection study. So if you look at the bullet items up there, one of the things is this, no council involvement in a working group. So we created a working group that's comprised of the FAA, Luke Air Force Base, City of Phoenix, a local Estancia residents, a pilot. And we've held these have been solely attended by staff. And the reason why is we wanted this to be really, truly conducted by third-party independent experts. And it's important that, I always say that Jim's company should be maybe retagged a data-driven public policy because we follow where the facts take us. We don't create a narrative and try to get the data to fit those facts. Here's what the data is, here's what the facts are, here's what it tells us, and it's our job to convey that to you. So tonight's presentation really focuses on the completed economic impact study and a couple of repeats discussion points, and you've seen this before, but why is an air park? And again, it's a top council priority, and it's an opportunity that we are evaluating. The purpose of all the studies we're doing is to thoroughly evaluate the opportunity. And that's so that you as a council, at some point down the road, can make a decision because you're fully informed. Again, why do we have economic development? We've talked about this before. Residential revenue is not sufficient to meet the needs of a growing community. We are a growing community. We know we're going to grow. It's just a fact. It's just not enough. We want to not only maintain a level of services and amenities, we want to increase them. So in order to do that, you must have economic development. So as a council, you're faced with this decision. Do you drive economic development to raise that revenue to meet that demand, or do you, raise taxes, or decrease level service or amenities? And council's been very clear on where their position is. Go out and get economic development. So again, this is another economic development opportunity that we're evaluating. Gets a lot of fanfare because the reality is, it's a big deal and it's got a massive economic impact. So some of the airpark finance questions we've gotten, and we want to make sure that we're very clear. One of the questions is, does this raise our tax rate? Absolutely not. And I'll say it again, it does not raise your tax rates. Property values, we hear this. Our property values can go down. Contrary, they're very likely to increase, and Jim will talk about this in a moment. We also talk about trade-offs. So we get the sense from the questions and the input we've gotten from the public is that, hey, if you do an air park, you can't do these other things. That is not true. So can you do a park? Can you do a hospital? Can you do a school if you do an air park? The answer is you can do them all. And the air park, and Jim's going to talk about this, potentially, with the economic driver, can help bring the revenues to fund all those other amenities and services. And another question is, how do you fund this? So there's two types of funding, I guess two avenues, and what I tried to do is simplify it. So you see on the screen says a NIPIAS route versus a non-NIPIAS route. NIPIA stands for National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. It took me a while to memorize that. So basically a NIPIAS route, if you think about it, is it's publicly owned. City owns it, county owns it, state owns the airport. If you go down that road, and again, you still have to do all these studies, you get 95% reimbursed. So simple math, $100 million, you're spending $5 million. So it's a pretty good return on investment. So I think as I've talked to citizens and explained that this isn't a $100 million hit, it's a $5 million hit or whatever that number is, that's a pretty good business play, we think. The other is non-NIPIAS, and a non-NIPIAS is privately owned and run. In that case, private industry is paying all of it. So we just want to make clear there's a couple of routes on funding this that we're trying to explain in very simple terms how we go about this. So last slide I have before I turn over to Jim is a little historical context. So this is not something that's new. Back in 2000, the city looked at, did feasibility studies, actually did 2 of them. And the question is like, well, why don't we use those studies? Well, it's 2024. So we don't want to use 2000 data for 2024. Back then, there really wasn't any public involvement. It never made it to council for a vote to go forward or what have you. Times have significantly changed in 24 years. As recently as 2017, a corporate airport was planned as part of the Amazon HQ2 proposal. We've posted the promotional video on the website, as well as an article talking about this corporate air park in North Peoria. There was no public involvement as well. And to fast forward to 2023, where we are right now, we've done the feasibility study, we've done the economic impact study, we're in the midst of the site selection study, but we really, really have been proactive on trying to get as much information out to the public as we get them. Some questions that we get, we don't have the facts yet, but when we have them, we provide them and we post them on a website. So at the end of the presentation, I have a slide that walks through all of the information that we have put out there. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jim Rounds. I think Jim has done, he mentioned to me, over 500 economic impact studies. He does work, all across the state. He does national work. So he's very well experienced. And again, his style of being a data-driven policy analyst really bodes well for what we're trying to achieve here and get you the facts you need. So with Jim, I'll pass that on to you and let you take it away.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, it's good to see you. Pretty straightforward economic analysis, but economic analyses aren't just done in a vacuum. It depends on what's going on in a particular community. And right now, I like what I'm seeing in terms of the economic development focus. When people ask me what community should we be looking at in terms of business expansion, I bring up Peoria first in the Northwest Valley, and your competition is Pinal in the Southeast Valley. And there's a reason for that. It's because a lot of the stars have become aligned. Now you're doing very well, but you still have retail leakage, you have economic development leakage, which means you still have some pent-up demand for additional business development. Now that greatly impacts how quickly a business park and an air park would develop. It also impacts the extent that you can have medium versus higher wage businesses coming in. And what we're anticipating seeing for the city is a movement towards higher wage businesses coming in at a higher scale. You don't want to just grow, you want to grow well, because that extra revenue that comes in pays for all the other stuff that you would like. You have to have the economic development and the business activity in order to pay for parks, in order to try to get other things that the taxpayers and the residents would like to see. You have to generate the revenue before you pay for it. And that's what the plan has been so far. Now, we analyze the area, what Rick calls outside the fence, which is the business park portion, the 220 acres. And people asked, how do you get to such large numbers, economic impact numbers? And I'll go through that briefly. In fact, you'll probably understand economic multipliers more than 99% of the economic developers out there after this short presentation. First, the goal is to attract new businesses. We want to foster the higher wage jobs. Like I just mentioned, we focused on the area outside the air park, but keep in mind, nothing is done in isolation. when you have something like what you're looking at, what you're considering, if it's done well, and it has to be done well, it can't just be developed, you have to develop these types of projects properly, it ends up with benefits beyond just what a model will pick up. I'll show you the numbers from the spin-off businesses that are created because the businesses spend money in the community and that creates extra jobs. The employees spend money in the community and that creates more jobs, and then they spend money. But if it's done right, you develop you develop this upward spiral of economic development in these key areas. And since we're focusing on a lot of high tech in the region, I'm picturing that you're going to be luring not just the semiconductor activity, but you're going to be luring healthcare, high tech. There's going to be all sorts of neat opportunities that are going to be coming here because it's pro-economic development, but you're also interested in education. You're interested in how can we have the proper workforce, because if you don't have the right inputs, including infrastructure, it also doesn't work. I just talked about outside the fence. Let me go to the next one. So here's how an economy works. This is how every economy works. It's not, if you have an economy where everybody works at a McDonald's and everybody shops at McDonald's, that economy doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to have businesses that export their products, and it brings money into the area. Those businesses spend, like I mentioned, locally, and they spend outside the local area. So you have to make sure that there's opportunities for the suppliers and other businesses to locate locally so you can collect those tax revenues as well. And that's where, over time, you'll see those statistics related to some of the economic development leakage and the retail leakage improve. But as these people spend money, that's what circulates. That's what that multiplier effect is that people talk about, because that $1 bounces around the economy. But it only bounces around the economy for so long. Eventually that dollar leaves. If you want to buy a car that's not made here, that money's going outside, and we have to make something else here in the state, or you have to make something in a city. You have to have base sector industries. And what we saw with the air park and the business park is it's not going to be like, people were asking, well, what air park is it going to be most like? Well, we have the Scottsdale Air Park that developed over time that is very large, and it morphed into more of a retail and office park. You have some of the other smaller air parks that are primarily industrial. A couple of them are 80, 90% industrial, and not the higher wage industrial that you would normally want to see. We're seeing something, we'd like to see something in between. I think that's the best match for what's being, what the city's profile and what's being considered. And so again, you have to look for, you have to have the right timing. If you were trying to do this 15 years ago, it wouldn't work. It could be the best idea, but you have the right timing, you have to have the right policy support, and then you have to have the right way of thinking about things outside the box. You have to look for partners in certain cases. You have to look and do good business recruitment. You have to work with the economic development teams and everything else. And the reason that I'm talking about these other items is this airport project has not been, at least in working with staff, considered completely in isolation. It wasn't, we're going to put something on the moon. What would the impact be if there's nothing anywhere near? It's, here's the impact of the air park, and those are the numbers I'm going to show you in a minute, but there's some other stuff that you'll want to consider as well. Here's just, it's a rough chart, but my colleague found it and liked it, so I kept it in there. It basically shows how money flows. The important thing about this particular chart is it shows how everybody benefits when you have base sector job creation. So when the businesses, the base sector business that would locate at the air park outside the fence, there'll be some aviation related, there'll be some other industrial related. When they spend money, they're going to create demand for extra small businesses. They're going to create small businesses being more profitable than they otherwise would. They're going to create demand for people that work at dry cleaners. They're going to create demand for dentists. They're going to create demand for pretty much every different type of industry you can think of. And so one thing that people forget when we're talking about economic development is when you focus on the core elements, the base sector businesses with these types of projects, you're helping everybody. You're giving everybody a leg up. It's not just focused on those individuals. It's the core that builds the community. Now, we ended up, this was probably the most complicated analysis that we've done because there were so many different potential scenarios because it's still being planned. Like Rick said, the concepts are there, but a lot of things are still being vetted. So we basically did 12 analyses for you at different timeframes for build out, different levels of income. And we looked at other airports, we looked at other studies. We've done enough on our own where we have our own database on looking at, if something's reasonable or not. You can pretty much tell after you've done enough of these if a number is in the ballpark that it should be or not. And we felt very good about our numbers. And what we call baseline, that's our conservative number. Now, we're talking about almost 8,000 jobs. That's the number that's been discussed. About half of those are related to the air park area, and about half of those are related to the extra demand within the community that'll be picked up. Now, people will ask, how do you know which ones are going to stay in the community and which ones are going to leave? You can look at traffic patterns. There's all sorts of data that you look at when you do this kind of modeling. Where the modeling often fails, though, is in communities like Peoria, because economic multipliers, when they take a look at a community and they say, here's the economic profile, based on that profile in the last 10 years, here's all the other industries that would tend to support it. That's how the multipliers are put together. When you're hitting these communities that are going into these inflection points that are starting to curve up in terms of higher wage jobs, more jobs locally, all the big businesses that located here, you have to make some adjustments. And what became very clear is when we did the big chip plant, we had to do an analysis because we were working with the state on some tax incentives to help locate them here. And the indirect jobs, the supplier jobs that the multipliers were picking up were less than what the businesses were actually bringing. So you know that it's one of those arguments where the performance is going to be greater than a lot of the modeling is going to show. But we wanted to focus on the baseline number because it's the most conservative. At this point, you don't want to be throwing out numbers that people will think are ridiculous. The $1 billion is a large number. That's the equivalent of a Super Bowl here every year. I've done so many analyses. People don't remember the numbers, but they'll remember statements like that. But that isn't even the optimal situation. I think it's going to be much more. Now, there's two things that these numbers exclude, that $1 billion excludes. You have the extra benefits of the community as a whole being able to develop more of these businesses because you have these individual catalysts. So again, these aren't done in isolation. You're going to have supply chains that are located. You're going to be working on infrastructure for these projects that's going to help supplement other projects coming in, which is going to make it very affordable to be recruiting additional high-wage businesses, and that's just how it works. When you have solid economic development programming, it's not just about that one business. You tend to get another one, then another one, then another one, and you get these economies of scale, and you get significant economic benefits. And the fact that the billion includes the conservative scenario, so the actual number is probably going to be between 50% higher. When you factor in the both, it'll be at least 50% higher. It could even be double this value if the area grows as you would expect it to. But you got to make sure you have the workforce. You got to make sure you have the infrastructure. Public policy matters quite a bit. And I know this for a fact because after we had the Great Recession at the state level, we had to figure out what to do. And we worked with the legislature, Kirk Adams and Andy Tobin, and we designed a jobs package for the state. We redid our tax rates, we looked at regulatory reform, we created a bunch of new economic development programs, and if you take a look at the state's numbers for per capita personal income, it was a 3-decade decline. All of a sudden, it shot back up in 2012, which is when things were implemented. It's not as dramatic here because the city's already doing well. But the question is, if you're doing well, why do you need something else? Well, you could be doing better. And something to keep in mind is when you don't do something, if you're doing well, your competitors are going to then pass you. And so you tend to take a step back. So yes, the $1 billion is a large number. People that aren't familiar with economic impact analyses will say, well, that doesn't make sense. I'm telling you, that's a very, very conservative number for what we're seeing is going to be developed. And if we included these additional numbers that are going to be tied to a project like this, if it's properly designed and built, it would be a lot bigger, and you're going to have a lot of additional opportunities, which is going to give you the extra revenue to pay for a lot of the things that the public's going to demand. This is going to generate more revenue than it's going to cost. These projects are what pays for government. These projects don't take money away from the others, they pay for them. It allows you to keep competitive tax rates and fees. It allows you to provide better services to the public. You can choose A or B. I like to think there's opportunities for both. So it is a myth that when you do a project like this, it's taking away from something else. It's not. If you don't have base sector jobs, your economy is done. Now that's true of the state, it's true of the Southwest, it's true of cities, it's true of counties. You have to have those types of businesses to pay for the other things. And I think I'll stop it there. Oh, let me just talk about ROI just very briefly. We work with conservatives and left-leaning folks at the Capitol because I'm a senior fellow at the Goldwater Institute, but I'm also the first one that the education community calls when they need presentations or advice on how their district should be reforming or things like that, because we provide fact-driven analyses and we're not biased in any way. No one political party completely captures what it is to do economic development. It really depends. But where we got through to people is looking at return on investment. I hear all the time, let's run government like a business. You can't run government like a business, but you can bring in business principles. Now, over the last 10 years, I'm about to hit the 10-year anniversary of starting my own company. I don't know, I've probably gone through 4 or 5 different iterations of computers for everybody. I didn't log those, I logged them in as an expense, but I didn't log that in as a revenue loss. That was something that was going to make us more productive over time. And that's just one small business. You're going to have to be making these types of investments that provide a positive ROI for the taxpayer. And so the way we evaluate projects at the state, city, county level is if you're spending $1, but within a certain amount of time, depending on the project, you bring in $2 or $3, that's an investment that a business would make. That's an investment that government should be making too after going through that exercise. And this will be part of that exercise as soon as staff start to fine-tune the project more. They have revenue examples. We may come back and do a little bit of refinement on those additional tangential revenues that are going to be coming in. And you'll be presented with an ROI at some point, and I guarantee it's going to be 3-to-1 to 4-to-1, somewhere in that range. And that,
I think we got one more there.
oh, you're,
Okay. So before we take some questions, I wanted to I went through and listed, all of the information that we've provided to date since we started this effort. So all of this is posted on the city websites. And as I said at the beginning here, the level of transparency that we have proactively endeavored in getting out publicly, again, I think has created this false impression that there's an imminent decision. And again, it is not the case. We want the public, obviously the council, to continue to ask questions, understanding that there's some answers we don't have yet. One of the questions, I'll just throw out there is, questions on environmental. If you looked at the first slide, that environmental study is on the back side. You can't do an environmental study if you don't know where a proposed airport site would be, where the runway alignments are going to be, where the airspace is going to be. You can't do that. So it's part of a process. This is a long process. And so there's no imminent decision. We are in a fact-finding mission. So I think if I look up there, what is not up there, so we have an airport video update that's coming out tomorrow. which was a response to 60 respondents asking questions. So panel 4 of us answered those questions to the best of our abilities. We will post tonight's presentation on. We will post this deck on. So there's a couple more there, but you know, there's roughly 18 different, add those to 18 different instances of posting this publicly. And we encourage the public to read through this and continue to ask questions. We're okay with that. And just be patient with us as we gather those facts. So with that, I think that's the last one.
Any questions from council? Councilmember Schaefer.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Rounds, quick question for you. You talked, your last slide there, the summary, and you talked about ROI and $1 billion. I think you said a 3-to-1, 4-to-1. What type of timeline are we looking at that?
Mr. Mayor, council member, there's different scenarios for build out. We provided a 5, 10, and 15 year, and then we had different types of development within that. That's why we had to do 12. And so when you're looking at projects that are sizable, let me step back. If you're working on an economic development prospect and the state is providing incentives and they're asking you to put in infrastructure, we always advise that you want to have a positive return on your investment within about 5 years. If you're working on education-related projects or transportation-related projects, you go 10 or 15. This one is a larger scale project, and so I would like to see the positive ROI as soon as possible, but it's going to depend on the development pattern. But the goal would be within 5 to 10 years, and then after that, it's pure profit. And again, that doesn't include all of the other things that are going to happen with it. So the numbers could go way up.
So, and I know there's a lot of variation in that. So we're roughly, you're saying between 5 and 10 years of completion of this air park in the surrounding area, we'd be breaking even and then generating revenue going forward. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So yes, in that's what we would recommend as the goal. So when we're analyzing public policy, and we do that all the time, for a project like this, you don't have a positive ROI the first year. Right. You have to make investments. Right. We would recommend that you evaluate it based on the outside date would be around 10 years. Now in this case, it depends on how it's built. There's still, like Rick showed, there's still a lot that's up in the air. And so that's why, even though there's a lot that's up in the air, we still have a significant impact, and it's just going to grow from here. It's not going to go down. You're not going to see another number from us where it goes down. I think it could end up doubling, but a lot of it depends on the specific project. But also keep in mind, I had to do this on a tourism investment when the state swept all the tourism money from the Office of Tourism, and we were debating whether or not they have a 16-to-1 ROI or 8-to-1. Our argument at the Capitol was if it's 1-to-1, you didn't save any money. So restore the funding, and they restored their funding. As long as it's better than 1-to-1, you're in good shape. Projects like this that we've evaluated more fully because they were already better baked or more fully baked, they've been producing around that type of an ROI, and it meant that it paid for a lot of other amenities throughout the communities.
Just one final comment or ask, actually, Mr. Rounds. For future evaluations, can we look at what the projected costs would be to the taxpayers for the ongoing operation? I think we're ballpark around $150 million for the build of the airport, but what would be like the ongoing operation? So when you build in that ROI, at what point do the taxpayers basically break even? If that's a fair ask.
Yeah, so Mayor, Councilmember Schaefer, that's actually a question that we answered in the video, and we actually had Mike answer this. But we don't know what the operating costs are until we finish the process, right? So, and then we don't know who's investing in it. So getting back to a non-NIPIAS solution, the answer is always going to be zero, because, it's zero. In a NIPIAS situation, it depends on what that air park ultimately looks like. So, that's a question we don't know, and that's why we do the studies, and we move further on. And now, again, I bring the environmental as another reason why I do the study. One of the questions is like, what about the noise? We can't evaluate the noise if you don't know where our part's going to be and what the flight pattern is going to be and so we just need to do the study so we can bring back that information. It's a great question. We don't have that answer yet.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Mayor.
Councilor Edwards.
Excuse me, thank you, Mayor. Mr. Rounds, question for you. So earlier in your presentation, you had mentioned how an air park benefits the local schools. Can you elaborate on that for me?
Sure, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor. You have property taxes that will go towards the schools. You have the sale of state trust land that indirectly goes to the schools because the interest is used on that. In some cases, we've seen communities develop special programs for special projects. I've been seeing that proposed for some large-scale solar projects. You could have something where you have some dedicated revenues going towards that. I don't know if that's going to be the plan or not, but that's also part of the potential discussion that I think it's worth having. There'll be enough revenue to maybe supplement something like that. And then maybe the biggest impact is going to be the lifting of the economic base in the city from these things moving forward, because it's not just the revenue from the air park, it's the business down the street that has more customers, and those properties are going to have higher value because the rents are going to be going up, but they're going to be earning a lot more revenue and then spending at another business. You're going to go through a whole wave of small and medium-sized business development, and they're going to be paying taxes. So there's a lot of different ways where it's going to benefit schools.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Crawford?
Thank you, Mr. Rounds. So you do studies across the state and the country, is that correct?
Mayor, members of the council, we focus on Arizona. This is the area where we have worked in every corner of the state, pretty much every government organization, but we did an airport analysis on Long Island. We've done economic analyses related to criminal justice reform in Mississippi. There's probably 10 to 15 different states where we've done individual projects, but so much of the economics and the knowledge base is local. This is where we think we have the best impact.
Great, thank you. And just to follow up, how do you maintain like an unbiased or impartial process for your firm when doing these studies?
That's how you run a business successfully. If we were biased, we wouldn't be the go-to group in the Arizona legislature when some very complicated public policy items come up. We're the first ones that are called. We worked on tax cut projects, we've worked on education funding projects, and our analyses are taken very seriously because sometimes we're also difficult to work with, because if a project isn't good, we'll tell the client it isn't good. If a public policy idea down at the Capitol isn't good and we do the analysis, you're just not going to see it presented, but we still have done several of those. That's how you get return business.
Councilor Finn?
Couple comments and a question. Appreciate the list, Rick. I appreciate the list of the things that have gone out with respect to this. Yeah, this slide here. And as I'm sitting here thinking about this, and I'm seeing where we're at in the process and the amount of work that's been done, we like to call this a slow burn in our organization. This is not. Everybody's kind of asking questions about, what about this and what about that? This is a really slow burn that we are in kind of I don't even want to say the middle because I might not even be doing that justice. There's a lot left, a lot of meat left on this bone before we get to a place where we can answer all of these specific questions. Is that a fair assessment?
Mayor, Councilman Finn, it's a very fair assessment. A lot of questions that we hear from the public internally, we say, we're asking that ourselves, or we have asked those ourselves. So it's absolutely, it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time.
Okay, and my question, more my statement, my question is, if I go back to the very beginning of you don't have to go slides.
Okay.
You had mentioned trade-offs, and I had not really heard that as a concern. Are there no trade-offs whatsoever for a airport being built? Or I guess that was kind of one of the first times I heard the trade-off piece.
So, Mayor and Councilmember Finn, I'll start and I'll let Jim jump in here. But as we look through the questions that came through, so the first time we had questions that came through was about 95 questions that came through for the webinar, and then we had 60 for this latest video. And as we start to look through the questions, one of the themes that popped out is, it's like, well, why can't we do this instead of an air park? Why can't we do this instead of, right? So we'd like a hospital instead of an air park. we want a school instead of, we want a park instead of. And the reality is they're unrelated. So it is an and discussion, not an instead of. So Air Park is not going to take away from any of those other possibilities. On the contrary, it's actually going to add to the ability to deliver those because it delivers revenues. If it's done properly, as Jim says, I'll let him jump in here. If it's done properly and it generates the revenues that we expect it to generate, primarily outside the fence, that's where we can do all of this and actually do it at a higher level service and higher level of amenities because we're driving dollars to those projects. So Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, agreed. One of the questions I think was, we need additional parks. Is this going to take away from that? But really, it's going to pay for it. And so that's where you got to talk about the economics. But I did want to make a point of, we've worked on a lot of projects even bigger than this, a lot bigger than this in some cases, smaller than this. This process is much more detailed. This list is not a normal list that we see. The outreach, the videos, the things that you're doing, that's not normal. I've seen billion-dollar decisions made at the Capitol in a half-an-hour meeting. I've seen counties and cities make decisions, not always good ones, by just having some discussions and going ahead and voting on it. You're putting in a lot of time on this. Now, I think in the end, it's going to benefit you'll benefit from that. It was a little bit frustrating for me at first because I was thinking, well, at what year should we be starting some of this development? And we had to, do all these extra analyses with different build-out periods because you're putting in a lot of thought. Now, I know this is a major project, and this is one of the first ones where you're really designing a lot of stuff internally, so you may think that this is normal. Some people are saying it's not enough. This is not normal. This is good policy. This is not what I see in other communities.
Councilor Dunn?
I have three questions. The first one, are there any federal or state agencies that have been identified for potential investment? And if so, what might that look like into the air park?
So, Mayor and Councilmember Dunn, that gets back to the NIPIAS versus non-NIPIAS. So, yes, to answer your question very directly, it's the primary funding source on a NIPIAS option is the FAA, and that's a 90% reimbursement. The other 5% comes from the Aeronautical Division of ADOT, Arizona Department of Transportation. So that's where you have funding sources of 95%.
So we have identified and named those sources and those.
Yes, that is correct. But, here's a caveat. If we don't do all these studies, which is required by the FAA, you don't qualify for those reimbursements. So that's why we're doing all these studies.
The second one is the location. Is there more than one location identified, or is there just one location identified in this study?
Another great question, Mayor and Councilmember Dunn, is that's what the site selection study currently going on is all about, is to identify a recommended site. And if it's a recommended site that warrants further study, then we can start answering even more questions. So the site has not been decided yet. But if you look at the feasibility study, I think there's 5 or 6 sites that were looked at. 2 of them were in Peoria, and those 2 sites were off of Lake Pleasant Parkway in 74. So, this is what Kaufman Associates is doing, is they're evaluating the sites. There's a boatload of analysis inherent in that they have to go through. But, those are the likely general areas.
I'm just asking these questions because there's a lot of discussion going on. So
I've heard.
so I think it's good to ask the question so everybody can, have the information or look how to find it. Environmental studies, are those studies being done, and are we evaluating the environment? And if so, how are we doing that?
Yeah, the answer is yes and yes, but the studies haven't started yet because you need to do the site selection study before you do that. Because, for example, I think some of the questions like, what about Lake Pleasant wildlife, things like that. Well, if you're going to place an air park in the Lake Pleasant area, then yeah, you would do that. But if you're not going to, you're going to evaluate the areas around the general vicinity. You're also going to evaluate, part of that environmental is the noise, question, which again, what are your flight patterns? Where are you at? So this is something that has to happen sequentially. And so the next step is to have a recommended site for, the council to look at, and we can make that. So a long way of answering that yes, but those studies just haven't been done yet because we have to do the site selection first.
So it seems reasonable, we're taking a look at it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Councilor Patena?
Thank you, Mayor. Rick, my question is a little aside from this presentation. Are you currently holding webinars for our citizens about the air park and the project? If so, how many have you had? How many do you plan to have? And then my further question is, are you finding compelling questions or concerns identified multiple times by some of the people that are watching these webinars?
So, Mayor and Councilmember Patena, we've held one webinar so far, and that's where we had 95 questions that came in, and that was, if I'm looking at the list up there.
June 27th.
Thank you, Mayor. And then we just yesterday shot a video in our studio here with answering another 60 of those questions. As far as repeatability of questions, yes, we're getting the same questions and over again. And so that's where we're trying to make sure that we are continually to re-message the same answers and the facts that we have. And I've put some of them up there, of course. Does this raise our tax rate? The answer is no. But both the webinar, you can watch that webinar again. If you just go to Peoria AZ and go to the Air Park site, all of this information's on there. You can watch the video tomorrow as well as the webinar. Tonight's presentation will be on there as well. The May 7th presentation is already on there. So we're really trying to put as much information out there as possible to answer those questions. And, if we have a citizen that missed the answer, ask it again and we'll answer it again.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Okay.